Hey guys, tonight we journey back to 14th century Europe, where the ringing of church bells carried across misty valleys. Narrow streets smelled of wood smoke and damp earth, and almost no one could imagine that an invisible enemy was already traveling toward them. Tonight, you will walk beside ordinary people, not famous kings, fearless knights, or wealthy merchants, but humble farmers, village healers, monks, craftsmen, widows, children, and travelers whose names have mostly disappeared from history. Their world felt permanent. Their seasons followed familiar rhythms. Yet, within only a few years, everything they believed about safety, family, faith, and survival would be tested by one of the deadliest disasters humanity has ever known. So, before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, dim the lights, perhaps keep a gentle fan humming in the background, and let's slowly drift into tonight's story. Long before anyone spoke the words Black Death, life moved with comforting regularity. Dawn arrived softly across fields of barley and rye, while thin streams of smoke rose from thatched cottages before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. Roosters announced the morning with great confidence, although they rarely managed to wake anyone before the village dogs had already begun their daily patrols. Most people owned very little. Their homes were built from timber frames filled with woven branches coated in mud. The floors were often packed earth scattered with fresh straw, and a single fire burned almost constantly in the center of the room, filling the air with warmth as well as smoke that slowly escaped through gaps in the roof. Our story begins in the spring of 1347 in a small farming settlement somewhere in northern France. The exact name of the village has been lost over the centuries, but villages like it existed everywhere across medieval Europe. Around 70 families lived there. Nearly everyone knew everyone else, and a stranger could be recognized from half a mile away simply because unfamiliar faces were so uncommon. One farmer, whose name we shall call Martin because records rarely preserved people like him, woke before sunrise, as he always did. His wife Agnes was already grinding barley into coarse flour, while their youngest daughter attempted to convince a stubborn chicken that it belonged outside rather than inside the cottage. Their eldest son repaired a wooden fence damaged during the previous night's rainstorm. It was an ordinary morning, and ordinary mornings were deeply comforting. Martin worried about familiar things. Would the harvest be large enough? Would one of the sheep wander into the forest again? Would the village mill finally repair its broken wheel? His thoughts never wandered toward distant kingdoms or foreign ports. The wider world felt unimaginably far away, yet hundreds of miles beyond his peaceful fields. Events had already begun unfolding that would eventually reach even this quiet place. Far to the east, trading caravans continued crossing enormous landscapes stretching from Asia toward Europe. Merchants loaded camels with silk, spices, precious stones, wax, wool, and countless other goods desired by wealthy customers. They stopped at crowded market towns, where dozens of languages blended into a constant murmur of bargaining voices. Every exchange of goods also carried less visible passengers. Tiny fleas rode unnoticed upon black rats, hidden inside sacks of grain, bundles of cloth, and wooden crates. No merchant saw danger in an ordinary rat. After all, rats lived almost everywhere humans did. They slipped beneath warehouses, climbed onto ships, and nested among food supplies. People disliked them, certainly, but nobody imagined they might carry a catastrophe capable of reshaping continents. Nature often hides its greatest power inside the smallest creatures. Back in Martin's village, spring gradually became summer. Wheat ripened beneath warm sunlight. Children gathered wildflowers along narrow paths, while older villagers repaired roofs before autumn storms returned. Every Saturday, several families walked together to a nearby market town where they traded eggs, cheese, onions, woven baskets, and cured meat. The marketplace offered more than commerce. It provided stories. Travelers described distant castles larger than entire villages. Pilgrims returning from sacred journeys spoke of magnificent churches whose stained glass windows glowed like jewels beneath the afternoon sun. Sailors claimed they had seen cities where ships crowded harbors so tightly that one could almost walk from vessel to vessel without touching the water. Some tales sounded unbelievable. Others sounded frightening. One afternoon, a merchant mentioned strange illnesses reported somewhere beyond the eastern seas. According to him, entire communities had become strangely quiet. Houses stood abandoned. Funeral bells rang constantly. Most listeners shrugged politely. Rumors traveled faster than facts. Every generation believed the previous generation had exaggerated distant disasters. People preferred discussing crop prices rather than diseases occurring hundreds or perhaps thousands of miles away. Martin certainly did. He purchased salt, exchanged greetings with neighbors, and returned home before sunset, carrying a sack of flour balanced across his shoulder. Life continued. Months quietly passed. Meanwhile, trade never stopped. Large merchant ships crossed the Black Sea before entering the Mediterranean. Their sails billowed proudly in coastal winds, while crews celebrated profitable voyages. The ships carried grain, cloth, timber, wine, and spices. They also carried rats. The rodents slipped through dark cargo holds almost unnoticed, feeding upon scattered grain and multiplying astonishingly quickly. Fleas feeding upon infected animals waited patiently for their next meal. Nobody inspected fleas. Nobody even knew they should. In October of 1347, several ships entered the busy Sicilian port of Messina. Dockworkers expected another ordinary trading day filled with heavy lifting and loud negotiations. Instead, they encountered something deeply unsettling. Many sailors aboard the arriving vessels were desperately ill. Some struggled to stand. Others never left their hammocks. Several had already died during the voyage. Witnesses later described swollen lumps beneath the arms and around the groin, accompanied by burning fevers and overwhelming weakness. The exact descriptions vary across surviving records, but nearly every account speaks of fear spreading rapidly among those who first encountered the mysterious sickness. Authorities reacted as best they could. Some ships were ordered away. Others had already unloaded cargo. The invisible chain had begun. None of this was immediately known inside Martin's village. His world remained calm. Winter approached gently. Families salted meat for colder months, chopped firewood, repaired clothing, and stored root vegetables beneath cool earthen floors. Evenings became longer. Stories replaced outdoor work. Grandparents recounted legends beside crackling fires, while children listened with wide eyes. The church remained at the center of community life. Sunday mornings gathered everyone beneath familiar wooden beams. Candles flickered softly, while priests reminded their congregations about patience, kindness, and faith. Life seemed governed by divine order. Hardships certainly existed: poor harvests, accidents, occasional fevers, but these belonged to ordinary existence. Few imagined that ordinary hardships would soon appear almost comforting by comparison. As snow blanketed fields during the winter of 1347 and early 1348, travelers became less common. Roads turned muddy before freezing solid. Villages grew quieter. Families spent most evenings indoors, mending tools and waiting for warmer weather. One particularly cold evening, Martin welcomed a traveling tinker into his home. The visitor repaired broken cooking pots in exchange for supper and a place near the fire while eating thick vegetable stew. The traveler mentioned unsettling news from southern towns. He had heard that certain ports no longer welcomed strangers. Some markets had closed unexpectedly. Several monasteries reportedly cared for unusually large numbers of sick people. Nobody at the table interrupted. The room remained silent, except for the crackling fire. Finally, Agnes asked a simple question. "Is it war?" The traveler slowly shook his head. "No." "What then?" "I do not know." Those 4 words settled heavily over the room. People can prepare for enemies they understand. They struggle far more against mysteries. Morning arrived, with pale sunlight reflecting from frozen fields. The tinker thanked the family and continued northward. Within hours, everyday routines returned. Martin split logs. Agnes baked coarse bread. Children chased each other through fresh snow. Life insisted upon normality. Elsewhere across Europe, however, normality was quietly disappearing. The disease advanced town by town, village by village, often following the same roads used by merchants, pilgrims, soldiers, and wandering laborers. Each traveler unknowingly connected distant communities into one enormous web. No kingdom understood the pattern. No physician fully recognized the cause. Most medical knowledge rested upon ancient theories involving imbalances of bodily humors, poisonous vapors, unfortunate planetary alignments, or divine punishment. Some treatments involved bloodletting. Others recommended fragrant herbs, sweet-smelling flowers, vinegar, prayer, or carefully prepared mixtures of spices. A few remedies may have comforted frightened patients. None stopped the plague. Still, spring eventually returned. Birdsong echoed across hedgerows. Snow melted into streams. Farmers eagerly prepared their fields. Martin noticed something unusual during his first visit to the nearby market after winter. The crowd felt smaller. Several familiar merchants had not arrived. One cheese seller quietly explained that roads farther south had become strangely empty. Inns reported fewer visitors. Entire families had remained home because neighboring settlements were experiencing unexplained sickness. The market itself continued operating. Coins changed hands. Children laughed. Fresh bread filled the air with its comforting aroma. Yet conversations sounded more cautious than before. People lowered their voices. They glanced toward strangers a little longer than usual. Fear rarely arrives all at once. More often, it begins as uncertainty, then whispered conversations, then uneasy silences, and only later does it become something impossible to ignore. As Martin and his neighbors packed their purchases for the journey home, none of them realized that the road stretching beyond the distant hills no longer carried only merchants and pilgrims. It carried history itself, and before another full season had passed, that history would arrive at their very doorstep. The first hints of change were so ordinary that almost nobody recognized them as warnings. When historians study the Black Death today, it is tempting to imagine that disaster announced itself with dramatic signs visible to everyone. Reality was quieter. Entire communities continued plowing fields, baking bread, repairing fences, celebrating weddings, and baptizing newborn children, while the plague moved steadily closer. The greatest danger was not that people ignored obvious evidence. It was that there was almost nothing obvious to see until it was already too late. Martin returned from the market carrying salt, 2 iron nails, a bundle of flax thread, and a small sack of dried peas. Agnes welcomed him with warm oat porridge, while their children eagerly searched through his purchases. Hopping, he had remembered a small treat from town. Instead of sweets, he produced a polished river stone that caught the sunlight beautifully. To the youngest child, it was worth more than silver. Life continued to measure wealth differently in small villages. A healthy cow mattered more than fine clothing. A reliable roof mattered more than elegant furniture. Good neighbors often mattered more than money itself. Spring settled comfortably across the countryside. Every morning began with birds singing before the first rays of sunlight reached the valley. Martin walked behind his oxen, guiding the heavy wooden plow through damp soil that released the rich scent of earth after months beneath winter frost. The work was exhausting but familiar. His muscles knew every movement before his mind even considered them. Across Europe, millions of people lived almost identical lives. Most never traveled farther than 20 or 30 miles from the place where they had been born. The world beyond those familiar roads existed mostly through stories. A traveler might describe enormous cathedrals whose towers disappeared into the clouds. A merchant might speak of ships larger than entire village streets. A monk might recount ancient libraries filled with books copied by hand over countless generations. Yet these places felt almost mythical to ordinary farmers. Martin's universe remained wonderfully small. Then one afternoon, another traveler appeared. Unlike the cheerful tinker who had stayed during the winter, this man looked exhausted. His boots were caked with layers of dried mud. His cloak had been patched so many times that almost none of the original cloth remained visible. Even his horse appeared unusually thin. The villagers greeted him politely. Hospitality remained an important duty. Travelers brought news, and news was valuable. While sharing supper inside the village alehouse, the stranger described towns farther south where churchyards had become unexpectedly busy. There are more funerals than weddings, he said quietly. Nobody laughed. The room fell still. An elderly carpenter asked the question everyone had been thinking. What sickness is it? The traveler hesitated. I cannot tell you. You saw it. I saw enough. What happens? The man stared into the fire before answering. People seem healthy one day. He paused. By the third or fourth day, many are gone. A woman standing nearby crossed herself silently. Another whispered a prayer beneath her breath. Martin listened carefully, but remained unconvinced. Illness visited every generation. Sometimes entire villages caught fevers during harsh winters. Sometimes children died from illnesses adults survived easily. Life had always been uncertain. Perhaps this was simply another difficult season. That explanation felt comforting. People naturally prefer familiar explanations over frightening mysteries. The traveler stayed only one night before continuing north. His words lingered far longer. Over the following weeks, conversations changed. Instead of discussing rainfall alone, neighbors quietly exchanged rumors. One merchant had failed to appear at the weekly market. Another family reportedly remained inside their home because everyone had fallen ill. Nobody knew whether these stories were connected. Rumors often grew larger as they traveled. Still, uncertainty has a peculiar way of settling into everyday routines. Martin found himself watching unfamiliar travelers more carefully. He noticed wagons arriving with fewer passengers than usual. He observed that some merchants seemed eager to finish business quickly before leaving town again. Nothing dramatic had happened, yet something invisible seemed to hang over every conversation. Even nature appeared strangely indifferent. Wildflowers continued blooming beside narrow roads. Bees drifted lazily among blossoms. Swallows built nests beneath cottage roofs, exactly as they had every spring. The seasons refused to acknowledge human fears. One Sunday after church, Father Guillaume addressed the congregation with unusual seriousness. He had received letters from another monastery farther south. Several brothers there had become gravely ill. The monastery requested prayers. No details accompanied the message, only concern. The priest encouraged everyone to remain faithful. Fear, he reminded them gently, often spreads faster than truth. His words were wise. Unfortunately, truth was moving steadily along the roads as well. Meanwhile, far beyond Martin's village, physicians struggled desperately to understand what they witnessed. Some believed poisonous air drifted from swamps or decaying matter. Others blamed unusual alignments of the planets. Several respected scholars argued that earthquakes had released harmful vapors from deep beneath the earth. These explanations sounded reasonable according to medieval knowledge. Nobody had yet discovered bacteria. Nobody understood infection. Nobody knew that a tiny organism, carried by fleas feeding upon rats, had begun one of history's greatest catastrophes. Doctors relied upon observation. They noticed swollen lumps. They recorded burning fevers. They described weakness so profound that patients often could not stand. Some physicians recommended carrying flowers, whose pleasant fragrance might cleanse polluted air. Others burned aromatic woods inside homes. Certain wealthy families filled small cloth pouches with herbs and spices, believing sweet smells offered protection. For many people, these rituals provided comfort. Comfort, however, was not the same as safety. Several weeks later, Martin visited the neighboring village to trade wool. Something immediately felt different. Normally, children played beside the central well. Today, only 2 remained outside. Several houses had closed their shutters despite the pleasant weather. The blacksmith greeted him politely, but spoke with unusual haste. You should finish your business before sunset. Why? The blacksmith lowered his voice. A family on the eastern road became ill. What kind of illness? I do not know. Have they recovered? The blacksmith did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the small church standing at the edge of the village. Its bell began ringing slowly. Once, twice, again, funeral bells. Martin instinctively removed his cap. Everyone nearby stopped speaking until the final note faded into the afternoon air. Death itself was not uncommon. What unsettled him was the silence afterward. Usually, after a funeral bell rang, conversation gradually resumed. Today, people simply looked at one another without words. completed his trade quickly. He chose the longer road home, avoiding the eastern cottages entirely, not because he believed he might become ill, because uncertainty had begun quietly influencing ordinary decisions. Fear rarely announces itself dramatically. Instead, it changes tiny habits. People avoid certain roads. They hesitate before shaking hands. They remain indoors slightly longer. Each decision seems insignificant. Together, they reveal a changing world. Back home, Agnes noticed his thoughtful expression before he spoke. "You heard more stories." He nodded. "Worse, I cannot tell." That evening, the family ate quietly. Even the children sensed something had changed. Outside, the village dogs barked repeatedly toward the distant road. No one could see what had disturbed them. Perhaps another traveler. Perhaps wandering livestock. Perhaps nothing at all. Night covered the countryside. Inside cottages across Europe, countless families drifted to sleep believing tomorrow would resemble yesterday. Many would awaken to ordinary mornings. Some would not. Days passed peacefully. Then came the first letter. The village priest gathered several respected elders after morning prayers. The message had traveled from a monastery nearly 60 miles away. Its handwriting trembled noticeably. Several monks had died. More had become sick. The writer asked neighboring communities to pray continuously. He also made an unusual request. If travelers from certain southern regions arrived, they should be questioned carefully before being welcomed. The suggestion puzzled everyone. Turning strangers away contradicted long traditions of hospitality. Yet desperate times often reshape old customs. The elders debated for hours. Should they refuse shelter? Should they continue offering food to every traveler? Would refusing strangers offend God? Would welcoming them endanger everyone else? No one possessed enough knowledge to answer confidently. In the end, they compromised. Travelers would still receive food and water, but they would sleep in the barn outside the village rather than inside family homes. It felt like a reasonable precaution. No one knew whether it would matter. Martin helped prepare fresh straw inside the barn. As he spread bundles across the wooden floor, he wondered whether people somewhere else were taking exactly the same precautions. Perhaps hundreds of villages, perhaps thousands. Human beings often respond similarly when facing uncertainty. Without realizing it, distant communities separated by hundreds of miles had begun making nearly identical choices. A week later, another traveler arrived. This time, his wagon carried no merchandise, only personal belongings. His wife sat beside him, holding an infant wrapped tightly in blankets. Two older children walked silently behind the cart. Their faces looked tired beyond their years. The village welcomed them cautiously. They explained that they had left their hometown because too many people were dying. No one asked for exact numbers. Sometimes details only deepen fear. The family accepted shelter in the barn without complaint. They appeared grateful simply to have stopped moving. During supper, Martin carried them fresh bread and cheese. The father thanked him sincerely. Before Martin returned home, curiosity overcame him. "Where will you go next?" The man looked across the dark fields. "I do not know." It was perhaps the saddest answer Martin had ever heard. Not because it lacked hope, because it lacked direction. Entire families had begun wandering roads without destinations, searching for places untouched by something they could neither explain nor escape. The next morning, they departed before sunrise. By midday, only wagon tracks remained. The wind slowly erased even those. Still, life continued. Seeds were planted. Lambs were born. Children laughed. The mill wheel turned steadily beside the stream. For a brief moment, it almost seemed as though the frightening stories belonged to another world. Then, near the end of May, a rider arrived at full speed from the market town. His horse was exhausted. Its sides heaved with every breath. The rider barely paused before speaking. "There are sick people in the town. Not rumors, not distant reports, not letters. The sickness had reached the nearest market, the very place where Martin and every neighboring farmer bought flour, salt, tools, cloth, and news. For the first time, the danger was no longer traveling toward them. It had arrived close enough to hear the church bells on a quiet evening, and before another market day came, Martin would make a decision that every ordinary family across Europe would soon face: a choice between protecting those he loved and preserving the fragile way of life they had always known. The news spread through the village faster than a summer thunderstorm. Before the rider had even watered his exhausted horse, children were already carrying fragments of the story from one cottage to another. Women paused while drawing water from the well. Men abandoned fences, plows, and half-finished repairs. Even the village dogs seemed unsettled by the sudden movement of so many people gathering in the square. Yet, despite the urgency, nobody truly knew what had happened. There were only pieces. Someone had heard that 5 people were ill. Another insisted the number was 20. One elderly shepherd confidently declared that the market itself had been closed. An hour later, another traveler claimed the market was still open, though nearly empty. Truth and rumor marched together. It became almost impossible to tell which was leading. Father Guillaume rang the church bell, not for a funeral this time, but to call everyone together. The villagers slowly filled the small church, removing their caps as they entered. Candles flickered against rough stone walls, casting warm light across anxious faces. Some families sat closer together than usual. Mothers held young children upon their laps instead of allowing them to wander between the benches. The priest waited patiently until the room became quiet. "My friends," he began softly, "we have received troubling news." No one moved. sickness reported in the south has reached Saint Tramy, the market town, only half a day's walk away. A murmur swept gently through the congregation. Saint Tramy was more than a place to buy flour or iron tools. It was where marriages were arranged, disputes settled, taxes collected, and festivals celebrated. Many villagers had relatives living there. Several visited nearly every week. Now the familiar town suddenly felt distant, or perhaps dangerous. Father Guillaume raised one hand. We must remain calm. Easy words, difficult practice. He explained that no one yet understood the illness. Some families in the town appeared untouched. Others had lost several members within days. The priest encouraged prayer. He also advised people to avoid unnecessary travel until more information became available. That suggestion alone represented an extraordinary change. Travel had always been part of ordinary life. Not constant travel, certainly, but enough to connect neighboring communities into one living network. Now, one of those threads was beginning to break. After the gathering ended, Martin walked home beside his closest neighbor, an older farmer named Etienne. Neither man spoke for several minutes. Finally, Etienne sighed. My daughter lives there. Martin knew. She had married a cooper 3 years earlier. Will you go? Etienne stared toward the distant hills. I don't know. There was no correct answer. If he traveled, he might bring illness back. If he stayed, he abandoned his daughter during a frightening time. History often remembers battles and kings. Ordinary people usually remembered impossible choices. The following morning felt strangely empty. Normally, several wagons would already be traveling toward Saint Tramy. Instead, the road remained quiet. Martin stood outside his cottage, watching the horizon. No merchants, no pilgrims, no traders, only birds crossing the bright morning sky. For the first time in his life, silence along the road seemed unnatural. Agnes noticed him watching. You've been standing there a long time. I know. Waiting. I suppose I am. For what? He considered the question. I don't know. That uncertainty had become everyone's companion. They waited for certainty, for reassurance, for news, for something understandable. Instead, days passed with very little information. Without regular travelers, rumors actually became fewer. Unfortunately, the rumors that did arrive sounded increasingly grim. One wandering shepherd reported that several inns farther south had closed entirely. A miller claimed whole households were refusing visitors. Another traveler insisted carts carrying the dead now moved through certain streets every morning. Nobody knew whether these stories were exaggerated. Nobody wanted to discover they were accurate. Life inside the village continued as best it could. Fields could not wait for fear. Seeds still required planting. Animals still required feeding. Bread still needed baking. The rhythm of survival left little room for panic. Martin found comfort in work. Each swing of the axe, each furrow behind the plow, each repaired fence post reminded him that some parts of life remained dependable. Even so, small changes slowly appeared. The village became quieter. People chatted less while collecting water. Children were called indoors earlier each evening. Visitors were welcomed politely, but from greater distances. No one consciously planned these changes. They simply happened. Human beings often adjust long before they understand why. Meanwhile, St. Remy struggled. The first families affected had hoped the illness would pass like countless fevers before it. Instead, neighbors began falling sick, then relatives, then servants. The town physician worked until exhaustion overtook him. He moved from house to house, carrying leather satchels filled with herbs, small knives for bloodletting, cloth bandages, and handwritten notes copied from ancient medical texts. Each evening, he returned home more confused than the day before. Some patients died within 3 days. Others survived a little longer. A handful unexpectedly recovered. Patterns remained frustratingly unclear. He advised families to burn fragrant herbs. He recommended fresh air whenever possible. He encouraged cleanliness according to the best understanding of his age. Nothing seemed consistently effective. One afternoon, a messenger finally reached Martin's village, carrying official instructions from local authorities. Travel should be limited. Large gatherings should be postponed. Anyone arriving from affected areas should report immediately to village leaders. These recommendations sounded sensible, yet enforcing them proved remarkably difficult. People depended upon movement. A blacksmith required iron. The mill required grain. Farmers required tools. Monasteries required supplies. Merchants earned their living by traveling. Stopping commerce, even briefly, threatened everyone's survival. For centuries, roads had represented opportunity. Now they inspired suspicion. Martin found himself studying every stranger who approached the village. One evening, a lone merchant requested shelter. His wagon carried bolts of cloth. He appeared healthy. He spoke cheerfully. Yet before inviting him inside, Martin hesitated, only for a heartbeat. But he noticed. The merchant noticed too. Hospitality had become cautious. The traveler slept in the barn, not because anyone believed he was ill, because nobody could be certain he wasn't. That single night reflected a transformation occurring across Europe. Trust itself had begun changing. The next week brought unusually warm weather. Sunlight shimmered across fields of young wheat. Wild roses bloomed beside winding paths. Sheep grazed peacefully beneath ancient oak trees. Nature displayed extraordinary beauty, while human anxiety steadily deepened. Sometimes history unfolds beneath brilliant blue skies. Disaster does not always arrive with storms. Late one afternoon, Martin's eldest son, Thomas, returned returned from checking sheep near the western woods. I saw smoke from where? The old road. Smoke often meant travelers. Martin climbed a nearby hill. Far away, perhaps 2 miles distant, he spotted a small campfire. Several wagons surrounded it. Unusual. Travelers generally stopped at villages, not lonely crossroads. Curiosity eventually overcame caution. The following morning, Martin and 2 neighbors walked toward the campsite, carrying bread and fresh water. As they approached, the reason became painfully clear. The travelers were avoiding villages, not because they feared local people, because local people feared them. One elderly woman thanked Martin for the food. "We've been turned away 3 times. Her voice carried no anger, only exhaustion. "We understand." Martin looked around the camp. Perhaps 15 people. Children, grandparents, young couples. No soldiers, no criminals, only families. "Where are you going?" A middle-aged man answered quietly. "Anywhere untouched." Martin almost asked where that might be. Instead, he remained silent. No one knew. The families accepted the food gratefully. They promised they would continue north before sunset. As Martin walked home, he realized something deeply unsettling. Only months earlier, every village along these roads would likely have welcomed such travelers. Now kindness battled fear. Neither side truly won. A few days later, Etienne finally made his decision. He would visit his daughter in Saint-Remy. Several neighbors tried gently persuading him otherwise. "What if you become sick? What if you bring it back?" He listened patiently, then answered with remarkable calm, "If she needs her father." He never finished the sentence. He simply embraced his wife and began walking. Martin watched him disappear beyond the distant bend in the road. The entire village silently prayed he would return. 3 days passed, then 5, then 7. No sign of Etienne. His wife waited each evening outside their cottage until darkness covered the valley. Every morning, she returned to the same spot. Hope can become a routine. On the 9th day, a single rider approached. Not Etienne, a messenger. He carried a small leather pouch. Inside lay Etienne's wooden rosary, along with a brief note written by a priest from Saint-Remy. Etienne had reached his daughter safely. She had already fallen ill. He remained beside her. He asked his family not to come. No further details. His wife clutched the rosary tightly against her chest. She neither cried nor spoke. Sometimes sorrow arrives too heavily for tears. The village understood. No one disturbed her that evening. As June slowly unfolded, another change became impossible to ignore. The birds still sang. The streams still flowed. The wheat continued growing taller every day. But the roads had become strangely empty. For generations, they had connected neighbors, families, monasteries, markets, and kingdoms. Now they seemed to separate them instead. Every traveler approaching from the south carried uncertainty. Every departure felt like a gamble. Martin often stood outside at dusk, watching those quiet roads stretching toward the horizon. He could not see the plague itself, only the spaces it created. Missing wagons, missing merchants, missing friends, and somewhere beyond those distant hills, invisible and relentless, the Black Death continued advancing, one village, one household, one ordinary family at a time. Before the summer reached its height, it would finally cross the last few miles, separating Martin's peaceful community from the greatest test its people had ever faced. Summer arrived with remarkable beauty. Morning sunlight stretched across fields of wheat that swayed gently beneath warm breezes. Bees wandered lazily among wildflowers, and swallows darted through the clear blue sky in search of insects. To anyone passing through the valley for the first time, the village would have seemed peaceful beyond imagination. That contrast would later become one of the most haunting memories recorded by survivors. The world had looked perfectly ordinary. Nature had given almost no warning. Martin rose before dawn, as he always had. He sharpened his sickle beside the doorway, while Agnes kneaded yesterday's dough into fresh loaves. Thomas led the oxen toward the pasture, and little Isabel followed him with determined enthusiasm, carrying a wooden bucket far too large for her small hands. Ordinary work offered comfort. Tasks repeated over countless seasons reminded people that life possessed a rhythm older than memory itself. Yet beneath that comforting rhythm, tiny changes continued accumulating. Several cottages now kept their doors closed longer during the day. Children no longer wandered freely from one household to another without permission. Visitors were greeted warmly, but from several steps farther away than before. Nobody announced these new customs. Fear rarely requires instructions. It teaches quietly. One afternoon, the village mill finally reopened after remaining idle for several days. The miller's youngest apprentice had developed a high fever, causing everyone else to stay home until he recovered. Fortunately, the boy slowly regained his strength. The news spread almost as quickly as stories of illness. People welcomed encouraging reports with surprising enthusiasm. Every recovery mattered. Every survivor reminded others that sickness did not always end in death. Martin noticed that hope itself had become valuable. Whenever someone heard of a person recovering, the entire village seemed lighter for a day or two. Then another troubling rumor would arrive. The balance shifted constantly between optimism and worry. Late in June, a merchant from the north stopped briefly outside the village. Unlike previous travelers, he refused food. He refused ale. He accepted only fresh water for his horse before continuing. Martin found the encounter unusual. "You seem to be in a hurry," he remarked. The merchant nodded. "I intend to stay ahead of it." ahead of what? The sickness? Martin frowned. You think you can outrun it? The merchant looked toward the southern horizon. I hope so. Hope. Again that word. Throughout history, hope has often traveled alongside uncertainty. The merchant disappeared along the northern road, raising a thin cloud of dust behind his wagon. No one in the village ever learned whether he succeeded. Several days later, Father Guillaume received another collection of letters. Unlike earlier messages, these arrived from multiple monasteries. Their tone had changed dramatically. Some described entire communities where nearly every monk had become ill. Others requested replacement priests because so many clergy had died while caring for the sick. One monastery wrote that only 3 brothers remained healthy enough to conduct daily prayers. The priest folded the letters carefully before addressing several village elders. If this continues, he stopped. Even he struggled to finish the sentence. Religious communities formed the backbone of medieval society. Monasteries copied books, cared for travelers, offered food to the poor, treated the sick, preserved knowledge. If they themselves were beginning to fail, the situation must be worse than anyone had imagined. That evening, Father Guillaume visited every household personally, not to spread panic, to prepare them. He encouraged families to store extra grain if possible, repair wells, gather firewood earlier than usual, remain patient, care for neighbors without neglecting their own households. His advice reflected practical wisdom rather than fear. No one objected. Martin spent the next several days strengthening fences and cleaning the family's small storage cellar beneath the cottage. Agnes dried herbs from their garden, hanging bundles from ceiling beams where warm air could preserve them for winter. The children helped gather berries from nearby woods. Life quietly shifted toward preparation. No one admitted exactly what they were preparing for. Across Europe, thousands of villages were doing remarkably similar things, without any central authority coordinating their actions. Ordinary people reached many of the same conclusions. Store food, limit travel, watch strangers carefully, stay close to family. Sometimes human instincts become surprisingly alike. The first truly alarming sign appeared not inside the village itself, but at the weekly bridge crossing several miles away. Normally, dozens of wagons crossed the old stone bridge every market day. This week, only 4 arrived. The toll keeper, an elderly man named Henry, later reported that he had never witnessed such emptiness. Roads that once echoed with merchants' voices now carried only wind. Even more unsettling were the wagons that did appear. Many were overloaded with household belongings, wooden chests, blankets, cooking pots, cradles, chairs. Entire families seemed to be moving, not relocating permanently to new farms, simply leaving, searching, escaping, but escaping toward where? No one could answer. Martin accompanied Thomas to the bridge 2 days later, hopping to exchange vegetables for iron nails. Instead, they found silence. Henry greeted them with tired eyes. I've counted. Counted what? The wagons. Martin waited. Last summer, I recorded 63 in one day. And now, Henry glanced down at his notebook. 5. Numbers sometimes explain history better than words. Martin purchased the nails he needed, but he lingered at the bridge for several minutes. He listened. Nothing. No distant wheels. No laughter. No traders calling greetings from the road. Only the quiet splash of water beneath the ancient stone arches. He had never realized how much life depended upon sound, until so many familiar sounds disappeared. On the journey home, Thomas asked a question. Father, yes, are we safe here? Martin looked across fields, glowing golden, beneath the afternoon sun. He wanted to answer immediately. Instead, he chose honesty. I don't know. Those words frightened Thomas far more than any comforting lie would have. Parents throughout history have often faced the same painful choice: protect children with certainty or prepare them with truth. That evening, Martin sat outside, watching the sunset. The sky burned with brilliant shades of orange and crimson. Agnes joined him, carrying 2 wooden cups filled with watered ale. For several minutes, neither spoke. Finally, she asked quietly, "If it reaches us?" Martin understood. "What then?" She nodded. He thought carefully before answering. "We stay together." Simple words, perhaps the only promise he could truly make. Families across Europe were reaching identical conclusions. They could not control the disease. They could only choose how they would face it. The following morning brought unexpected visitors. 3 Benedictine monks approached the village carrying walking staffs and small leather satchels. Dust covered their sandals. Their robes looked worn from long travel. Father Guillaume welcomed them immediately. The brothers explained that they had been sent north delivering letters because several monasteries farther south had become unable to maintain regular communication. One monk, Brother Lucas, appeared particularly exhausted. During supper, he quietly described what they had witnessed. We buried 12 brothers in 8 days. No one interrupted. We rang the bell so often. He paused, that eventually we stopped. The room became perfectly still. Martin could not imagine a monastery without bells. Their sound measured time itself. Morning prayers, midday, evening, funerals, festivals, silence. If the bells had stopped, not because there were no deaths, but because there were too many, the thought lingered long after supper ended. The monks departed at sunrise. Before leaving, Brother Lucas offered one final observation. The illness moves strangely. What do you mean? Martin asked. It appears. He gestured toward the road behind them. Then weeks later, somewhere else, he pointed north, as though following people. No one fully grasped the importance of those words, yet they contained one of the closest observations anyone had made. The plague was indeed following people, not carried by curses, not drifting randomly through the air, moving invisibly with travelers, goods, wagons, ships, and the rats and fleas accompanying them. Knowledge existed only as scattered pieces. The complete picture remained hidden. July began unusually warm. Heat settled across the valley from dawn until long after sunset. Water in shallow ponds grew stagnant. Dust coated every road. Work became exhausting before midday. Then one evening, the church bell rang unexpectedly, not for worship, not for a funeral, not for celebration. A rider had arrived from St. Tremy once again. This time, everyone gathered immediately, without being summoned. The messenger removed his cap before speaking. His face alone revealed that the news would not be good. The physician is dead. A murmur spread through the crowd. The apothecary is also gone. More silence. The town council requests that nearby villages avoid unnecessary visits. Martin felt the weight of those words settle over everyone present. If the physician, the man who understood illness better than anyone in the town, had not survived, then knowledge alone was no protection. The messenger unfolded another sheet of parchment. There is one more message. He hesitated before reading. The sickness has now appeared in 2 villages north of St. Tremy. Martin instinctively looked toward the road leading home. 2 villages north. He knew those villages. He had traded sheep there only last autumn. One more stop beyond them, and the road ended at his own community. For the first time since the rumors had begun months earlier, no one asked questions. No one debated. No one argued about exaggerated stories. The invisible distance separating them from the plague had become frighteningly small. It was no longer a tale carried by weary travelers. It was approaching along roads every villager knew by heart. Martin slept very little that night. Each time he closed his eyes, his thoughts wandered toward the roads stretching south through forests and fields, connecting one settlement to another like threads woven into an enormous tapestry. For years, those roads had brought welcome visitors, fresh supplies, and stories from places he would never see. Now, every road seemed capable of carrying something unseen. Before sunrise, he stepped quietly outside. The air felt unusually cool after the previous day's heat. A faint mist drifted above the nearby stream, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called one final time before surrendering the morning to singing blackbirds. Everything appeared exactly as it always had. That ordinary beauty felt almost unsettling. Agnes joined him a few moments later, wrapping a woolen shawl around her shoulders, despite the mild weather. "You didn't sleep." Neither did you. She smiled faintly. There wasn't much point. They stood together without speaking, watching the eastern sky gradually brighten. In moments like these, silence often said more than conversation could. By mid-morning, the village elders gathered beneath the great oak tree near the church. It had served as a meeting place for generations. Disputes had been settled beneath its branches. Harvest celebrations had begun there. Marriage agreements had been witnessed there. Today, however, its shade sheltered worried faces rather than cheerful ones. Father Guillaume unfolded the latest message once again. The neighboring villages request cooperation. What kind of cooperation? One farmer asked. If travelers arrive from affected places, they should not enter until their health can be observed. Several people exchanged uncertain glances. How long? Another asked. No one knows. The priest admitted the answer reluctantly. That uncertainty made planning almost impossible. Some suggested building temporary shelters outside the village. Others feared even that might be dangerous. One woman quietly reminded everyone that travelers still needed food. We cannot simply leave people to starve. No, Father Guillaume agreed. We cannot. Compassion had not disappeared. It was simply being asked to coexist with fear. By afternoon, several young men began constructing 2 simple wooden shelters beside the old pasture, nearly half a mile from the nearest cottages. They were little more than roofed frames, with walls woven from branches. Comfortable they were not, but they offered exhausted travelers a place to sleep without entering the village itself. Martin volunteered to help as he hammered rough wooden pegs into the ground. He wondered whether anyone would ever use the shelters. Part of him hoped they would remain empty forever. 3 days passed peacefully. The harvest advanced beautifully. Golden heads of wheat bowed gently beneath warm breezes. Children laughed while chasing butterflies through meadows. Even the anxious conversations became slightly less frequent. Human beings possess a remarkable ability to adjust when disaster fails to arrive immediately. Ordinary routines quietly reclaim attention. Perhaps some villagers began thinking the sickness would never reach them after all. Perhaps the distance was enough. Perhaps God had spared their valley. Hope returned cautiously. Then, on the 4th morning, Thomas came running from the southern pasture. Father, Martin looked up from repairing a wagon wheel. There are people on the road. Travelers themselves were not unusual. Thomas's expression was, "How many?" I counted 7. Martin climbed the nearby hill, overlooking the valley. Far below, a small group slowly approached. Not merchants. They carried almost nothing. No wagons, no pack animals, only bundles tied across their shoulders. As they drew closer, Martin could see they were exhausted. Dust covered their clothing. One elderly man leaned heavily upon a walking stick. A young mother carried a sleeping child, wrapped tightly against her chest. Another little boy stumbled repeatedly, his legs clearly too tired to continue. The travelers reached the wooden shelters shortly before noon. Father Guillaume welcomed them there, while several villagers carried bread, water, and bowls of vegetable stew. The visitors accepted everything gratefully. They explained they had walked for nearly 5 days. From where? Martin asked gently. The oldest man named a village everyone recognized. It lay only 20 miles to the south. Martin felt his stomach tighten. What happened? The old man removed his cap. It began with one family. He stared toward the ground. Then another. He paused. And another. His voice had become almost a whisper. We buried 23 people. No one interrupted. We left because... Again he stopped. This time, a younger woman finished the sentence. There was no one left to help us. The words settled heavily over everyone present, not because 23 deaths sounded unimaginable, because the survivors themselves had abandoned their homes. Leaving one's village in medieval Europe was extraordinarily rare. Families often lived upon the same land for generations. To walk away from everything familiar required desperation beyond ordinary understanding. Father Guillaume offered the travelers shelter for the night. They accepted thankfully. Village leaders quietly agreed they should continue north the following morning, not because anyone wished them harm, because no one knew whether remaining nearby might endanger everyone else. That evening, Martin carried extra blankets to the shelters. The little boy, who had struggled along the road now, slept soundly beside his mother. Nearby, the elderly traveler gazed silently toward the sunset. My grandfather built our house, he said, without looking away. Martin listened. My father repaired it. Another pause. I expected my sons would inherit it. He smiled sadly. I never imagined I would leave without locking the door. Martin found no words. Sometimes the greatest tragedies are expressed through the smallest details. The old man was not mourning furniture or possessions. He mourned unfinished goodbyes. Morning arrived with brilliant sunshine. The travelers thanked everyone repeatedly before continuing north. Several villagers watched until they disappeared beyond distant trees. No one celebrated their departure. Instead, everyone quietly returned home. Work suddenly seemed more important than conversation. Activity kept frightening thoughts occupied. That afternoon, Martin noticed something unusual inside the grain storage shed. A rat. Nothing extraordinary about that. Rats had always lived near stored grain. This one, however, moved strangely. Instead of darting away immediately, it staggered uncertainly across the floor before collapsing beside a wooden barrel. Thomas picked up a shovel. I'll throw it outside. Martin stopped him. Wait. Neither man knew exactly why. Perhaps because every ordinary thing now invited closer attention. Using a long stick instead, Martin carefully pushed the animal toward the doorway. It did not move. Thomas frowned. "I've never seen one like that." "Neither have I." They buried it beyond the fields, then thought little more about it. History would later reveal that such moments mattered enormously. At the time, they appeared insignificant. Over the following week, several more rats were found dead near barns and grain stores. Again, villagers noticed. Again, no one understood. Some blamed unusually hot weather. Others suspected poisoned grain. One elderly woman insisted owls had frightened them. Everyone had a theory. None came close to the truth. Elsewhere across Europe, countless communities reported similar observations. Dead rats appeared shortly before human illness, but without knowledge of bacteria or fleas. The connection remained invisible. Nature had left clues. Human understanding simply lacked the tools to read them. Near the end of July, Etienne's wife finally received another letter. The handwriting belonged to a priest in Saint Remy. Etienne himself had become ill shortly after caring for his daughter. She had died peacefully. Her father survived long enough to arrange her burial. 2 days later, he followed her. Father Guillaume read the letter privately before carrying it to Etienne's widow. No crowd gathered. No ceremony accompanied the news. Only 2 people standing quietly beside a cottage doorway. The widow accepted the folded parchment with trembling hands. "I knew." The priest looked surprised. "How?" "I stopped waiting." Grief changes shape over time. At first it watches every road. Eventually, it understands. The village buried an empty coffin beneath the churchyard soil. Several days later, there had been no possibility of bringing Etienne home. His family needed somewhere to mourn. As neighbors gathered around the simple grave, Martin noticed something different. People no longer embraced one another as freely. Condolences were offered with gentle nods rather than long embraces. No one had instructed them to behave differently. Experience itself had become the teacher. That evening, after the funeral, Thomas quietly asked his father, "Will we leave if it comes here?" Martin considered the question carefully. Leave? Where would they go? Every road connected to another village. Every village connected to another town. There seemed no obvious direction, untouched by uncertainty. Finally, he answered honestly, "I think." He looked toward their cottage. "Our home is here." Thomas nodded slowly. Neither father nor son realized how soon that decision would be tested. Because while they spoke beneath a peaceful evening sky, another traveler was already walking toward the valley. He carried no letter, no warning, no visible sign that anything was wrong. He simply sought food, water, and a night's rest after many weary miles on the road. By every appearance, he looked perfectly healthy, and that was precisely what made the next chapter of the village's story so frightening. The traveler reached the edge of the valley shortly after midday. Martin noticed him first while repairing a broken section of fence beside the pasture. At a distance, he appeared no different from dozens of other men who had passed along the same road over the years. He carried a weathered leather satchel across one shoulder, wore a faded brown cloak despite the summer warmth, and leaned upon a sturdy ash walking staff polished smooth by countless miles. Nothing about him suggested danger. If anything, he looked relieved to have found another peaceful village after days of dusty roads. As custom required, Father Guillaume walked out to greet him before he reached the first cottages. The priest smiled warmly. "Welcome, my friend." The traveler returned the smile. "God's peace be with you." "And with you." The conversation sounded perfectly ordinary. Martin watched from the fence, unable to explain why he felt uneasy. Perhaps it was simply because every unfamiliar face now inspired caution. The traveler introduced himself as Pierre, a cooper by trade. He explained that he had been searching for work after leaving a town where business had almost completely disappeared. "There are fewer barrels needed when markets close," he said with a tired laugh. Father Guillaume nodded sympathetically. "Have you been well?" Pierre answered without hesitation. "I have." The priest believed him. Pierre looked healthy. His face carried good color, despite weeks of travel. His movements appeared steady. His voice remained strong. There seemed no reason to doubt him. Still following the village's new custom, Father Guillaume offered him food and directed him toward the small shelter outside the pasture. Pierre accepted graciously. "I understand," he said. "Many villages are doing the same." That sentence lingered in Martin's thoughts. Many villages, the same precautions, entire communities separated by forests, rivers, and kingdoms, had quietly begun living according to similar rules. By evening, several villagers had carried bread, cheese, onions, and fresh water to Pierre's shelter. He thanked each person individually. He even entertained several curious children by carving a tiny wooden bird from a scrap of oak. Using a small knife he carried in his satchel, the children laughed as the little toy balanced upon one finger. For a few precious minutes, the atmosphere felt almost normal again. Martin found himself relaxing. Perhaps they had become too suspicious. Not every traveler carried illness. Not every stranger represented danger. Perhaps life truly could continue despite the frightening stories. After supper, Pierre sat outside the shelter, watching the sunset. Martin joined him for a while. The two men spoke about ordinary things: harvests, weather, road conditions, the quality of timber in different regions. Pierre described villages where vineyards climbed gentle hillsides, while Martin spoke proudly of the fertile soil surrounding their valley. Neither man mentioned death. Not once. As darkness settled across the fields, Martin returned home feeling unexpectedly lighter. Agnes noticed immediately. You seem happier. I think we've allowed fear to become larger than life itself. She looked hopeful. You believe things may improve. I don't know. He smiled. But perhaps every traveler isn't bringing disaster. That night, the village slept peacefully. The next morning, Pierre woke before sunrise. He thanked Father Guillaume once more, accepted a loaf of bread for the road, and continued north. Several children waved as he disappeared beyond the bend. One little girl still clutched the wooden bird he had carved. The entire encounter soon became another ordinary memory. Or so everyone believed. 3 days later, Martin visited Henry at the old stone bridge. The toll keeper appeared unusually distracted. You've heard, Henry asked quietly. Heard what? The village north of here. Martin frowned. What about it? They've reported sickness. Martin stared at him. Already? Henry nodded slowly. Very suddenly, a chill passed through Martin, despite the summer heat. The village north. That was the direction Pierre had traveled. Coincidence? Perhaps. Roads connected many places. Travelers constantly moved between them. Still, the thought remained. When Martin returned home, he said nothing. He did not want to spread another rumor based upon little more than timing. Yet uneasiness settled over him once again. The following week unfolded strangely. No travelers arrived. No merchants appeared. The roads remained almost completely empty. The silence itself became oppressive. Even the children noticed. Where has everyone gone? Isabel asked one afternoon. Agnes brushed her daughter's hair gently. They're staying home. Why? The little girl was too young to understand. Agnes searched for words. Sometimes people become frightened. Of what? She hesitated. Things they cannot see. Isabel accepted the answer with surprising seriousness. Children often recognize mystery long before they understand it. As August began, the harvest reached its busiest period. Entire families worked from sunrise until evening, gathering wheat before storms could damage it. Despite growing anxiety, the fields demanded attention. Grain would not wait for history. Martin swung his sickle hour after hour beneath the blazing sun. Thomas bundled cut stalks into neat sheaves. Agnes followed behind, collecting loose grain that might otherwise be wasted. Hard physical labor left little energy for fearful conversation. For several days, the village almost resembled its former self. Laughter occasionally drifted across the fields. Neighbors shared water and simple meals beneath scattered oak trees. Someone even sang an old harvest song remembered from childhood. Its melody floated gently over the valley. For a brief afternoon, worry loosened its grip. Then came the crows. Martin noticed them first. A large flock circled repeatedly above the southern road before settling beyond a distant hill. Hundreds of black wings rose and fell together. Thomas looked up. They found something, probably a dead animal, nothing unusual. Yet by evening, another flock appeared, then another. The birds seemed strangely drawn toward the road leading from the south. The next morning, 2 shepherds discovered the reason. A horse stood alone beside the roadside. Its harness remained attached to an empty cart. No driver, no passengers. The horse appeared hungry, but otherwise unharmed. Martin joined several villagers walking to inspect it. Inside the cart, they found sacks of flour, 2 barrels of salted fish, and several bolts of cloth. Everything remained untouched. There was no sign of struggle, no blood, no broken wheels, nothing, only an abandoned wagon, waiting quietly beneath the morning sun. Father Guillaume searched the nearby woods with several volunteers. They found footprints. Then, nearly half a mile away, beneath a large beech tree, they found the driver. He had not been attacked. His money remained inside his belt. His goods remained inside the wagon. He lay peacefully upon the ground, as though he had simply fallen asleep during his journey. The villagers removed their caps. Father Guillaume knelt beside the man. No one spoke. After several moments, the priest stood slowly. "We'll bury him here," someone asked. He nodded. "We do not know where his family lives." The stranger received a simple burial near the roadside, marked only by a rough wooden cross. Martin helped dig the grave. As his shovel cut through the dry summer soil, he noticed something else. Flies, far more than seemed ordinary. Again, he thought little of it. The horse was led into the village and given water. The abandoned goods were stored safely until someone might eventually claim them. Life resumed, or tried to. That same evening, Martin's old sheepdog refused to enter the grain barn. The faithful animal stood outside growling, softly toward the darkness within. Thomas carried a lantern inside. Nothing, no foxes, no thieves, only silence. Then he noticed another dead rat beside the far wall. This one looked much like the others. No obvious wounds, no sign of poison, just stillness. By now, several villagers had reported finding similar animals. The mystery deepened. Father Guillaume suggested cleaning every barn thoroughly. People agreed, not because they believed rats caused the illness, simply because cleanliness seemed sensible during uncertain times. Throughout the following day, families swept storage sheds, removed spoiled grain, repaired broken walls, and sealed holes wherever possible. It felt productive. Doing something often eases fear, even when the true danger remains unknown. That evening, as the sun dipped below the western hills, Martin noticed smoke rising from the southern horizon. Not one fire, several. He counted 5 separate columns drifting slowly into the sky. Too many for ordinary cooking fires. Thomas stood beside him. "What do you think happened?" Martin watched silently for a long moment. I don't know, but deep inside, he feared he did. Some villages had begun burning abandoned bedding, clothing, and household belongings in desperate attempts to stop the mysterious sickness. He had heard rumors. Now, for the first time, he was seeing the evidence with his own eyes. The wind shifted gently, carrying with it the faint smell of distant smoke, and somewhere beyond those unseen hills, another village was fighting a battle it could neither understand nor win. Before many more days had passed, Martin's own community would no longer be watching events from a distance. They would become part of the story themselves. For several days after the distant smoke appeared, the village existed in a strange state between fear and routine. People continued harvesting grain because the harvest could not wait. They repaired roofs because autumn rains would eventually arrive. They milked cows, baked bread, mended clothing, and carried water from the well. Yet every ordinary task now unfolded beneath an invisible shadow. Conversations frequently stopped when strangers approached. Eyes lingered on the southern road. Every church bell heard in the distance caused people to pause and listen. The valley itself remained beautiful. That almost made the situation harder to understand. The wheat stood golden and ready. The orchards promised a good crop of apples later in the year. The stream flowed as clearly as ever. If someone had arrived without knowing the stories spreading across Europe, they would have believed they were looking at a prosperous and peaceful community. History often hides disaster behind ordinary scenery. One warm morning, Martin and Thomas worked near the edge of the western field, gathering the final bundles of grain. The work was repetitive but satisfying. Each completed row represented security for the coming winter. As they worked, Thomas suddenly stopped. "Father," Martin glanced up. "What is it?" Thomas pointed toward the road. "A rider. Nothing unusual." Then Martin noticed how fast the horse was moving. The animal was lathered with sweat despite the early hour. Its rider leaned forward urgently, urging every possible ounce of speed from the exhausted beast. Neither man spoke. Both instinctively knew that such haste rarely carried good news. The rider reached the village square within minutes. By the time Martin arrived, a crowd had already formed around him. Father Guillaume stood near the front. The messenger struggled to catch his breath. His face appeared pale beneath a layer of road dust. Finally he spoke. "The village of Bremont." Several people exchanged worried glances. Everyone knew Bremont. It was the nearest settlement south of the valley, only a few miles away. "What happened?" someone asked. The messenger swallowed. "The sickness is there." Silence, complete silence. The words landed with a weight that everyone immediately understood. Not another town, not another region, not another distant community described in a traveler's story. Bremont, close enough to walk to before midday. The messenger continued. "It spread very quickly. How quickly? An elderly farmer asked. The rider looked down, faster than anyone expected. That answer alone revealed enough. Martin felt Agnes move closer beside him. Neither spoke. The crowd gradually dispersed after receiving instructions to remain calm and avoid unnecessary travel. Remain calm. The phrase had become increasingly difficult to obey. That evening, the church was more crowded than Martin had ever seen. Nearly every villager attended prayers. Even those who rarely came appeared quietly in the pews. Candles filled the small building with flickering golden light. The familiar scent of wax and old wood offered comfort. Father Guillaume spoke gently, not about punishment, not about doom. Instead, he spoke about courage, about helping one another, about facing uncertainty together. Many people found reassurance in his words. Others simply appreciated hearing a calm voice. Outside, darkness settled over the valley. Inside, hundreds of similar churches across Europe. Countless communities were holding nearly identical gatherings. The next morning brought a heavy stillness. No travelers arrived. No wagons appeared. The roads remained empty. Martin worked near the barn, repairing a broken wheel, when he heard shouting from the direction of the pasture. He immediately dropped his tools. Several villagers were running toward the temporary shelters. Something had happened. By the time Martin arrived, a small crowd had already gathered. One of the shelters was occupied. A traveler had arrived during the night. No one had seen him. No one knew when he appeared. The man sat inside on a blanket. At first glance, he looked exhausted. Then Martin noticed something else. The traveler was trembling, even in the summer heat. Father Guillaume knelt beside him. "Can you tell us your name?" The man's lips moved slowly. "Jean." His voice sounded weak. "Where have you come from?" Jean named a village farther south, one that few people in the crowd recognized. The priest offered him water. The traveler drank greedily. Then he began coughing. Not violently, just enough to make everyone uneasy. The crowd instinctively stepped backward. A few moments later, Jean lowered his head into his hands. His entire body seemed exhausted beyond measure. Martin felt a knot tighten in his stomach. For months, they had heard stories. Now they were staring directly at someone who appeared genuinely ill. The difference was enormous. Fear transformed from an idea into a reality. Father Guillaume instructed everyone except 2 volunteers to leave. The crowd obeyed immediately. No one argued. No one lingered. Martin walked home in silence. Agnes already understood from his expression. He was sick. "I think so." Neither said anything further. There was nothing useful to add. The remainder of the day passed slowly. People worked, but their attention remained fixed upon the shelter outside the village. By evening, another report arrived. Jean's fever had worsened considerably. He struggled to stand. Father Guillaume and 2 volunteers continued caring for him despite growing concern. The priest had always taken his responsibilities seriously. Now everyone witnessed the true depth of his courage. He entered the shelter repeatedly, while others hesitated even to approach. The following morning, church bells rang unexpectedly, not for worship, not for celebration, not even for a funeral. They rang because Father Guillaume wished to gather the village immediately. The crowd assembled quickly. The priest appeared tired, very tired. His eyes revealed a sleepless night. Jean died before dawn. No one spoke. Several villagers lowered their heads. The death itself was sad, but everyone understood what frightened them. The man had arrived, carrying more than his belongings. Father Guillaume continued. We buried him beyond the pasture. A sensible precaution, yet anxiety continued spreading through the crowd. Questions filled every face. Had he carried the sickness? Could others become ill? Had anyone already been exposed? No one possessed answers. The priest raised one hand. For now, continue your work. Care for your families. We will proceed carefully. Again, sensible advice. Again, difficult to follow. Martin returned home. He tried repairing tools, then cleaning the barn, then organizing grain stores. Nothing held his attention. His thoughts repeatedly drifted toward the shelter, toward Jean, toward Braymont, toward all the stories they had heard over the previous months. By afternoon, another unsettling event occurred. One of the volunteers who had helped care for Jean failed to appear for work. At first, nobody worried. Perhaps he was resting. The man had spent much of the previous night assisting Father Guillaume. Yet by evening, his wife visited the priest. Her husband had developed a fever, a very high fever. The news spread rapidly, too rapidly. Martin knew exactly what everyone else was thinking. One sick traveler, now one sick villager. Coincidence suddenly felt much harder to believe. That night hardly anyone slept well. Doors remained closed. Families stayed together. The usual evening conversations near the well never happened. The entire village seemed to be holding its breath. Morning arrived beneath a gray sky. Clouds covered the valley for the first time in days. The weather matched everyone's mood. Shortly after sunrise, another church bell rang. Once, twice, then again. Slowly, the funeral bell. Martin froze. He knew what it meant. Someone had died. But who? The answer arrived moments later. The volunteer. The fever had taken him during the night. A healthy man, only days earlier. Gone. The reality struck the village harder than all the rumors combined. For months, the plague had belonged to other people, other towns, other roads, other families. Now it had claimed someone everyone knew, someone whose children played beside their own, someone who had laughed with neighbors only a week earlier. The distance had vanished. Fear no longer stood outside the valley. It lived among them. As villagers gathered for the funeral, many noticed another troubling detail. Several people were absent. At first, the missing faces seemed unimportant. A family staying home, an elderly neighbor resting, a farmer busy elsewhere. Yet by evening, whispers began circulating. One absent villager had developed a fever, then another, only a handful, but enough to make everyone realize that the true battle had finally begun. The Black Death had arrived, not with armies, not with banners, not with dramatic announcements. It had entered quietly. One traveler, one fever, one funeral, and now, for the first time, Martin's village stood at the edge of the same nightmare that had already swallowed countless communities across Europe. The morning after the second funeral felt unlike any morning the village had ever known. Usually, dawn brought familiar sounds that blended into a comforting rhythm. Roosters crowed from scattered farmyards. Cows called impatiently to be milked. Axes struck wood. Children laughed before beginning their chores. This morning, the valley remained strangely quiet. People were awake. They simply stayed indoors. Thin streams of smoke still rose from cottage chimneys, but doors remained closed. Window shutters opened only slightly, just enough for cautious eyes to study the road outside before disappearing again. Martin stepped into the cool morning air, carrying 2 buckets toward the well. Normally, he would have greeted half a dozen neighbors along the way. Today he met only one, an elderly woman named Marguerite. She smiled politely from several paces away. Neither moved any closer. "Good morning," Martin said softly. "And to you." They both paused. Almost everyone in the village had spent a lifetime shaking hands, sharing tools, embracing relatives, and gathering shoulder to shoulder after church. Now, without anyone giving instructions, distance had quietly become part of everyday life. Marguerite filled her bucket. "I never thought," she began, then stopped. Martin waited patiently. "I never thought I would fear speaking to my own neighbors." Her words stayed with him long after they returned to their homes. Fear changes more than behavior. It changes ordinary human connections. Later that morning, Father Guillaume visited each household once again. Unlike previous visits, he did not step inside. Instead, he remained outside each doorway, speaking with families through open doors or windows. He asked simple questions. Is everyone well? Has anyone developed a fever? Does anyone need food? The questions themselves revealed how quickly circumstances had changed. Only a few weeks earlier, such conversations would have seemed unimaginable. Now they had become necessary. Martin assured the priest everyone remained healthy. Father Guillaume smiled with visible relief. May it remain so. Yet Martin noticed something different. The priest looked exhausted. Dark circles surrounded his eyes. His shoulders seemed slightly bent. as though the worries of the entire village rested upon them. He had buried strangers. He had buried neighbors. He continued visiting every family despite knowing the danger. History often remembers kings for their victories. It remembers priests like Father Guillaume because they refused to abandon ordinary people. That afternoon, the village council met beneath the great oak once again. This time, fewer people attended, not because they lacked interest, because everyone feared gathering in large numbers. The discussion centered upon survival rather than prevention. How should food be delivered to households where illness appeared? Who would care for children if both parents became sick? Should healthy families continue helping one another with the harvest? Every question carried consequences. Every answer involved risk. Martin volunteered to help deliver food if needed. Several others did the same. No one considered themselves particularly brave. They simply understood that villages survived only through cooperation. By evening, another household reported fever, then another, still only a handful, but enough to establish a pattern. The sickness was no longer visiting isolated individuals. It was beginning to spread. Agnes noticed the growing tension inside their own home. The younger children whispered instead of playing loudly. Thomas worked longer than necessary in the fields. Perhaps hopping labor would quiet his thoughts. Even meals had changed. Conversation came slowly. Everyone listened for distant church bells. No one admitted doing so. Everyone did. 3 days passed. The harvest continued despite everything. Golden grain could not be abandoned. If winter arrived without full storehouses, those who survived the sickness might still face hunger. Martin joined several healthy neighbors, cutting wheat from dawn until late afternoon. The work brought unexpected comfort. Sweat replaced worry for a while. Muscles focused upon familiar movements. The steady rhythm of sickles slicing through stalks reminded everyone that some parts of life remained unchanged. During a brief rest beneath an oak tree, one young farmer looked across the fields. "Do you hear that?" The others listened. "Nothing. Exactly." Silence. Normally harvest season echoed with songs from neighboring farms. People sang while working because music made long days pass more quickly. This year, the songs had almost disappeared. Not because people had forgotten them, because few felt like singing. Late that afternoon, Martin noticed smoke rising from one cottage near the eastern edge of the village. Nothing unusual. Families cooked supper every evening. Then he realized the smoke was darker, thicker. Several villagers quietly walked toward the house. Outside stood the owner, carefully feeding clothing, blankets, and straw mattresses into a large fire. Martin approached cautiously. "What happened?" "My wife became sick yesterday." The man stared into the flames. The priest suggested burning anything she used. He looked unconvinced. "I don't know whether it helps. Martin understood. No one knew. Across Europe, countless families had begun trying similar measures: burning bedding, washing walls, scrubbing floors, opening windows, lighting fragrant herbs. Every action represented hope more than certainty. Still, hope often motivates people when knowledge fails. The following morning, Martin awoke before sunrise to an unfamiliar sound. Not church bells, crying, a child. The sound drifted faintly across the valley. Then another voice. Then silence. Agnes quietly placed a hand upon his arm. Don't. She knew exactly what he intended. He wanted to go, to help, to discover what had happened. Instead, he remained where he was. Sometimes compassion required restraint. Sometimes rushing towards suffering only created more suffering. Hours later, Father Guillaume confirmed the news. The child had survived. His mother had not. The entire village seemed to age slightly that day. Death among the elderly felt tragic, but understandable. Death among young parents struck differently. It reminded everyone that the sickness followed no comforting rules. By the end of the week, several cottages displayed small bundles of evergreen branches above their doors. The custom varied from region to region. Some believed evergreen symbolized hope. Others believed certain plants purified the air. Whether the branches truly offered protection mattered less than what they represented. People needed symbols, visible reminders that they had not surrendered. Martin gathered fresh pine branches from the nearby woods and placed one above his own doorway. Thomas watched silently. "Do you think it works?" Martin smiled gently. "I think hope is never wasted." That evening rain finally arrived. Soft at first, then heavier. For hours, it washed dust from rooftops and filled the air with the rich scent of wet earth. Many villagers welcomed the storm. Some believed fresh rain might cleanse the valley. Others simply appreciated cooler weather after weeks of heat. When morning came, everything looked renewed. Leaves sparkled beneath sunlight. The stream flowed faster. The fields shimmered with countless droplets. For a brief moment, the world appeared fresh again. Then the church bell rang. Once, then again. Another funeral. Later that same afternoon. Another. The second bell felt somehow heavier than the first. One funeral had become two. Two suggested a pattern impossible to ignore. Martin attended neither burial. Very few people did. Father Guillaume had begun limiting the size of funeral gatherings. Families mourned quietly from their own homes. The old customs of entire villages walking together behind coffins had become too dangerous. Loss itself had become lonely. That realization hurt almost as much as the deaths. Near sunset, Martin climbed the familiar hill overlooking the valley. He often came there to think. From the summit, he could see every cottage, the church, the stream, the fields. Smoke rose peacefully from chimneys as evening meals were prepared. At first glance, everything looked unchanged. Then he began counting. One cottage, its shutters remained closed. Another, no smoke from the chimney. A third, no movement in the yard. Small absences, tiny details, yet together they painted a picture no one wished to acknowledge. The village was beginning to fall silent, not all at once, one household at a time. As Martin stood watching the sun sink below the distant hills, a familiar figure slowly climbed the path toward him. It was Father Guillaume. The priest looked older than he had only a month earlier. For a while, the two men simply watched the valley together. Finally, Martin spoke. "Can we stop it?" The priest did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the cottages below, where candles were beginning to glow behind small windows. "I do not know." Honest words, painful words. After another long silence, he added quietly, "But we can choose how we live while it is here." Martin nodded slowly. The sickness might decide who fell ill. It might decide who survived. But kindness, courage, compassion, those choices still belonged to the living. Neither man realized that before another week had passed, those choices would be tested more severely than either of them could possibly imagine. The days that followed settled into a rhythm no one had ever expected to learn. Each morning began with the same quiet question shared silently in every household: who was still healthy today? Martin no longer woke thinking first about the weather or the harvest. Before even stepping out of bed, he listened. He listened for coughing inside the cottage. He listened for Agnes moving about the kitchen. He listened for the children whispering from the corner where they slept. Only after hearing those familiar sounds did he allow himself to breathe a little easier. For one more morning, his family remained well. Outside, the village was changing in ways that would have seemed impossible only a month before. The blacksmith no longer kept his forge burning from dawn until dusk. With so few travelers and almost no trade, there was little work to be done. The alehouse opened only occasionally. Its benches, once filled with laughter after long days in the fields, now remained mostly empty. Even the village dogs barked less often. There were simply fewer strangers passing along the road. One afternoon, Martin carried a sack of grain to the mill. The familiar building stood beside the stream exactly as it always had. The great wooden wheel continued turning steadily, powered by the current that cared nothing for human suffering. Yet inside, the mill felt strangely hollow. Only the miller himself remained. Usually 3 apprentices worked beside him. One had become ill. Another stayed home, caring for his parents. The youngest had left with relatives farther north. Before the sickness reached the valley, the miller poured grain into the hopper without speaking. The sound of grinding stones filled the silence. Finally, He looked at Martin. "I miss the noise." Martin understood immediately. The customers, the conversations. He rested one weathered hand upon the wooden frame of the mill. This place was never quiet. Martin glanced around the nearly empty room. The miller was right. For generations, people had waited here while flour was ground. They exchanged news, argued about weather, discussed marriages, harvests, and village gossip. The mill had always been as much a meeting place as a workplace. Now people arrived one at a time, collected their flour, left quickly. The sickness had not only taken lives, it had taken ordinary moments. On his way home, Martin passed the village well. Only Agnes stood there filling buckets. Months earlier, there would have been a line of neighbors waiting their turn. Children would have chased one another around the stone wall. Someone would almost certainly have been telling an exaggerated story about a fox stealing chickens. Today, the well reflected only the cloudy afternoon sky. Agnes looked up as he approached. "Did you hear?" Martin set down the sack of flour. "Hear what?" "Marguerite has become ill." He closed his eyes for a moment. The elderly woman he had spoken with only days earlier, the one who feared speaking too closely with her own neighbors. Now she lay in bed with a fever. "I'll tell Father Guillaume," Martin said. "He already knows." Of course he did. The priest somehow seemed to know everything almost immediately. Not because rumors spread quickly anymore, because he visited nearly every household every day. No one could remember when he had last rested properly. That evening, Martin saw the priest walking slowly between cottages, carrying a small basket. Inside were loaves of bread, dried beans, onions, and a small jug of fresh water. Several villagers had quietly begun leaving food outside the church each morning. No names, no recognition, simply gifts for families unable to leave their homes. It became an unspoken tradition. Whoever had enough shared a little. No one asked who had contributed. No one asked who had received. Need itself became sufficient explanation. History often celebrates grand acts of heroism, yet survival during the Black Death frequently depended upon countless anonymous kindnesses that no chronicler ever recorded. A loaf of bread left quietly outside a door, a bucket of clean water, fresh firewood stacked beside a cottage before sunrise. Simple acts, essential acts. 2 mornings later, Martin and Thomas finished repairing a section of fence damaged by wandering cattle. As they gathered their tools, Thomas stopped suddenly. "Look," he pointed toward the churchyard. A long line of freshly turned earth stretched along one edge of the cemetery. No crosses yet, just prepared ground. Martin stared silently. The gravedigger had always dug graves one at a time. Now he was preparing several in advance, not because they were already needed, because experience had taught him they soon would be. It was one of the first visible signs that people were beginning to think differently. Planning no longer focused upon the harvest alone. It included death. That realization lingered with Martin throughout the day. Near sunset, Father Guillaume finally stopped by the cottage. He looked exhausted beyond words. Agnes immediately handed him a bowl of hot vegetable stew. The priest smiled gratefully. "I cannot stay long." "You'll stay long enough to eat," Agnes replied firmly. For the first time in many days, Father Guillaume laughed. Only briefly, but the sound felt almost unfamiliar. As he finished the meal, Martin quietly asked, "How many?" The priest understood. He thought for a moment before answering. 9 households. Martin's heart sank. 9. Not everyone inside those homes had fallen ill, but illness had entered 9 cottages. In a village this size, that number felt enormous. "Some are recovering," the priest added gently, noticing Martin's expression. It was important to remember. Not every fever ended the same way. Some people survived. Those rare recoveries became precious sources of hope. One young shepherd had been too weak to stand for nearly a week. Now he could walk again. An elderly widow, who everyone believed would die, had slowly regained her strength. Their stories spread quietly through the village. People needed reminders that survival remained possible. The following morning, heavy fog settled across the valley. Visibility shrank to only a few dozen yards. Trees appeared as dark shadows, drifting through pale mist. The church bell sounded strangely distant despite standing only a short walk away. Martin liked the fog under ordinary circumstances. Today it felt unsettling. Hidden things seemed closer. As the mist gradually lifted, another figure emerged along the northern road. A rider. Everyone tensed instinctively. The man approached slowly, rather than at great speed. His horse walked with tired, careful steps. When he reached the village, Martin immediately recognized him. Henry, the toll keeper from the old stone bridge. Except he looked older, not by years, by experience. His beard had grown untidy. His clothing hung loosely upon him. Deep lines surrounded his eyes. Father Guillaume welcomed him warmly. "You've come." Henry nodded. "I've closed the bridge." Several villagers stared in surprise. Closed? The bridge had remained open for longer than anyone could remember, even during floods, even during wars. "What happened?" Martin asked. Henry looked toward the south. "There is almost no one left crossing." He removed his cap. For 3 days, his voice became quieter. "I counted only one wagon. The road that had once connected countless communities had become nearly empty. Trade had almost stopped. Travel had nearly vanished. Europe itself seemed to be holding its breath." Henry explained that nearby villages had begun avoiding one another completely. Markets no longer operated regularly. Several inns stood empty. Many roads had become silent, except for the occasional messenger or desperate family searching for relatives. He had locked the toll gate not because authorities ordered him to, because there was no longer anyone to collect tolls from. The bridge had outlived its purpose. Martin found that image deeply moving. An ancient bridge, built to unite places, standing ready, yet almost no one remained willing to cross it. That afternoon, Henry helped distribute food to several households before continuing north to stay with distant cousins. As he departed, he turned once more toward Martin. "I've worked that bridge for 28 years. Martin nodded. "I know. I've never seen the road empty." He paused. "I pray I never see it again." The old tollkeeper disappeared into the fading light. His footsteps gradually faded. The village became quiet once more. Late that evening, just as Martin prepared to close the cottage door for the night, someone knocked gently, not loudly, not urgently, just 3 soft taps. He opened the door. Standing outside was Father Guillaume. The priest's lantern illuminated only part of his face. His expression alone told Martin something had changed. "I need your help." Martin immediately reached for his cloak. "What happened?" The priest hesitated only a moment. Thomas, the miller's apprentice. Martin remembered the young man who had fallen ill weeks earlier. "He's taken a turn for the worse." Without another word, Martin followed the priest into the darkness. The narrow path leading toward the mill seemed longer than ever before. Above them, the moon slipped behind slow-moving clouds. The only sound came from the steady rush of the stream, turning the great mill wheel. Even in the middle of the night, the wheel never stopped. Neither, it seemed, did the relentless march of the Black Death. The lantern cast a small circle of golden light across the narrow path. As Martin and Father Guillaume made their way toward the mill, beyond that gentle glow, darkness swallowed everything. The familiar valley felt strangely unfamiliar at night now. Every cottage they passed remained tightly closed. No voices drifted through open windows. No laughter escaped from evening gatherings. People no longer visited one another after sunset. The world had grown smaller. As they approached the mill, the steady rumble of grinding stones had ceased. Only the water wheel continued turning, its slow creaking echoing through the darkness. As the stream pushed endlessly against weathered timber, the miller stood waiting outside. He looked relieved to see the priest. "Thank God." Father Guillaume placed a reassuring hand upon the older man's shoulder. "How long has he been worse?" "Since late afternoon." The miller struggled to steady his voice. "He was speaking this morning, and now he barely opens his eyes." Martin followed them inside. The familiar smell of fresh flour still filled the air, though it seemed weaker than usual. Everything appeared exactly as it always had. Sacks of grain rested neatly against the walls. Wooden tools hung from their pegs. The great millstones stood silent in the center of the room. Only one thing had changed. The young apprentice lay upon a simple bed near the fireplace. His breathing was shallow. A damp cloth rested across his forehead. His mother knelt beside him, gently holding one of his hands. She looked up as Father Guillaume entered. Hope flickered briefly across her face, not because she believed the priest possessed miraculous cures, simply because no family wished to face suffering alone. The priest knelt quietly beside the bed. He spoke softly to the young man. The apprentice's eyes opened for only a moment. He seemed to recognize the familiar voice. His lips moved slightly. No sound emerged. Then he slipped once more into exhausted silence. Martin remained near the doorway. There was little he could do. Like so many others throughout Europe, he found himself witnessing suffering without possessing the means to stop it. That helplessness became one of the defining experiences of the Black Death. Not merely grief, but helplessness. For nearly an hour, the cottage remained almost perfectly quiet. Only the crackling fire and the turning water wheel disturbed the silence. Eventually, Father Guillaume rose. He looked toward the miller. "I will return before sunrise." The older man nodded. He understood. The priest had many households to visit before morning. Martin walked back beside Father Guillaume, beneath a sky filled with countless stars. For a long while, neither spoke. Finally, Martin broke the silence. "Do you ever feel afraid?" The priest smiled sadly. "Every day." Martin looked surprised. You thought faith removed fear." Martin nodded. Father Guillaume gently shook his head. "No." He looked upward. "Faith simply teaches us how to walk despite it." Those words remained with Martin for years afterward. The following morning, church bells did not ring. Martin noticed immediately. Normally, Father Guillaume rang them shortly after sunrise. Today, the bell remained silent. An hour passed. Still nothing. The unusual quiet drew worried glances throughout the village. Then Martin saw the priest approaching from the direction of the mill. His pace alone revealed the answer. The apprentice had not survived the night. This funeral would be different. The young man had spent nearly his entire life in the village. Everyone knew him. Everyone remembered him, carrying sacks of grain larger than himself, while laughing at his own clumsiness. Children had admired him. Older men had praised his willingness to work. His death reached beyond one household. It touched the entire community. Only immediate family attended the burial. Others watched quietly from a respectful distance. No one complained. Everyone understood why gatherings had become smaller. Still, the absence hurt. Grief usually sought company. Now grief often stood alone. After the funeral, Martin returned to the fields. The harvest could not be postponed indefinitely. Several healthy neighbors worked silently beside him. The familiar harvest songs remained absent. Only the whisper of sickles through grain broke the afternoon stillness. Suddenly, Someone called from the far edge of the field. A wagon approached. For the first time in nearly 2 weeks, everyone looked up. The driver stopped well before reaching the workers. He remained seated, almost as though uncertain whether he should come closer. Martin recognized him, a merchant named Roland, who visited several times each year. Normally cheerful and talkative, Roland now looked thin and deeply tired. "I've brought salt," he announced, "and lamp oil." His voice sounded strangely cautious. "No cloth?" someone asked. Roland slowly shook his head. "No demand. No spices. No buyers." He climbed down carefully from the wagon. "I've traveled 3 days. How are the roads?" Martin asked. Roland gave a weary smile. "Empty." The same answer again. "Empty." He described villages where market squares stood deserted. Churches remained open, but many shops stayed closed. Fields in some places had gone unharvested because entire families had fallen ill. Others harvested whatever they could with neighbors helping one another. Every region struggled differently, yet the stories shared one common theme. Life had slowed, not because people wished it, because loss forced it. Roland sold his supplies quickly. No one lingered to bargain over prices as they once had. Business ended within an hour. Before leaving, Martin quietly asked, "Will you return next month?" The merchant looked toward his wagon. "If God allows." It was not a promise, simply hope. As the wagon rolled away, its wheels echoed along the nearly deserted road. The sound gradually faded until silence reclaimed the valley. That evening, Thomas sat outside sharpening tools. He worked carefully, though Martin noticed his son glancing repeatedly toward neighboring cottages. "What are you thinking?" Thomas stopped. "Do you remember the spring festival?" Martin smiled faintly. "Of course. The dancing, the music, the wrestling matches." Thomas nodded. "It feels like another lifetime." Martin understood exactly what he meant. Only a few months had passed, yet the world before the plague already felt distant. Memory itself seemed divided into 2 parts. Before and now. Several days later, encouraging news finally arrived. One household, previously thought to be gravely ill, reported that every family member had survived. The father remained weak, the mother still tired easily, but all 4 children had recovered. The announcement spread quickly. Smiles returned, if only briefly. People desperately needed stories of survival. They reminded everyone that the plague did not claim every life it touched. Father Guillaume visited the recovering family that afternoon. When he emerged, Martin happened to meet him along the road. "They're stronger," the priest said. "Truly." He nodded. "They'll need time." Then, for the first time in many weeks, the priest allowed himself a genuine smile. "We must remember those who live, as well as those we bury." Martin realized how important those words were. Without hope, despair could become another illness entirely. Late that afternoon, clouds gathered unexpectedly from the west. Strong winds swept across the valley, bending wheat almost flat against the earth. Within minutes, heavy rain began falling. Not gentle summer rain, a violent storm. Lightning flashed across dark skies. Thunder rolled continuously through the hills. Families hurried indoors. Doors slammed shut. Animals crowded into shelters. The storm lasted for hours. When morning finally arrived, branches lay scattered across roads, and several fences had collapsed beneath fallen trees. Oddly enough, the destruction lifted spirits. For an entire day, healthy villagers worked together, repairing storm damage. Neighbors who had hardly spoken for weeks found themselves lifting beams, clearing paths, and rebuilding fences. Practical work overcame fear. Shared purpose briefly restored something the plague had taken. As Martin and Thomas raised a broken section of fencing near the churchyard, Father Guillaume approached carrying a small basket. He handed each worker a piece of fresh bread. From the convent, Martin looked surprised. "They still bake." "They do." The nearby convent had continued preparing bread every morning, despite its own hardships. Several sisters had become ill. Others had recovered. Yet each dawn they baked enough loaves for themselves and several neighboring villages. Their quiet generosity reached people they would never meet. History would preserve almost none of their names. Yet countless lives were made easier by their work. That evening, Martin carried one extra loaf to Marguerite. The elderly woman had recovered enough to sit outside her cottage beneath the fading sunlight. She accepted the bread with trembling hands. "I never expected to see another summer evening." Martin smiled warmly. "I'm glad you were wrong." She laughed softly. The sound felt wonderfully ordinary. For just a moment, it seemed the village might slowly find its footing again. Neither of them noticed the lone rider crossing the distant ridge to the south. His horse moved slowly, painfully slowly. Long before he reached the valley, he had already traveled through 3 villages where the sickness had returned after weeks of quiet, and the message he carried would remind everyone of a difficult truth. The Black Death did not always pass in a single wave. Sometimes it came back. The rider arrived just after sunrise. Unlike previous messengers who had urged their horses to exhaustion, this man traveled with slow, deliberate movements. His horse limped slightly, and every piece of leather upon its harness looked worn by months of constant travel. Martin recognized neither the rider nor the small emblem stitched onto his cloak. Yet Father Guillaume greeted him with immediate respect. The 2 men spoke quietly outside the church, while several villagers waited nearby, pretending not to listen. News had become as valuable as food. After several minutes, the priest turned toward the gathering crowd. "The rider comes from the bishop's household." Everyone grew still. Messages from church authorities rarely traveled without good reason. The messenger unfolded a carefully protected parchment. Rain had stained its edges, and repeated folding had softened the creases. He read slowly, ensuring every word carried across the square. Several regions farther south had believed the sickness was ending. For weeks, no new cases had appeared. Markets had reopened. Travel resumed. Families returned to abandoned homes. Then, without warning, the illness appeared again. Not everywhere, only in scattered communities. Enough to remind everyone that caution remained necessary. The writer lowered the parchment. No one knows why. Martin noticed disappointment spread quietly through the crowd. Many had begun believing that if they simply endured long enough, the danger would disappear like a harsh winter. Instead, uncertainty remained. Father Guillaume thanked the messenger and offered him breakfast before he continued north. As the rider departed, the villagers drifted slowly back toward their daily work. Nobody spoke very much. The message had not brought immediate danger. It had brought something almost equally difficult: patience without knowing how long it would be required. That afternoon, Martin and Thomas inspected the grain stores beneath their cottage. The harvest had been generous despite everything. Wooden bins stood nearly full. Dried beans hung from ceiling beams in woven sacks. Bundles of onions rested upon shelves beside carefully stored apples. Agnes smiled with quiet satisfaction. If winter comes early, we'll manage, Martin finished. Preparation had become one of the few things ordinary people could still control. Throughout Europe, survivors of the plague learned to value preparation more deeply than ever before, not because it guaranteed safety, because it offered peace of mind. 2 days later, another encouraging sign appeared. The blacksmith reopened his forge for a full day's work. The ringing of hammer against anvil echoed across the valley. For the first time in weeks, children paused to listen. Several older villagers smiled. The sound represented more than metal being shaped. It represented continuity, life insisting upon moving forward. Martin visited to repair the iron tip of his plow. The blacksmith looked healthier than he had in months. I almost forgot what this place sounded like. Martin laughed. So did I. For a little while, they spoke not about sickness, but about horseshoes, broken hinges, and the coming autumn. Ordinary conversation felt strangely luxurious. When Martin returned home, he noticed Isabel sitting beneath an apple tree with several other children. They were playing, properly playing, not whispering indoors, not watching roads nervously, simply pretending that smooth stones were tiny sheep, while twigs became fences. Children possess an extraordinary ability to reclaim joy, even during history's darkest chapters. Watching them, Martin realized something important. The village had not surrendered. It had changed, but it still lived. The following Sunday, The church filled once again, not as completely as before the plague. Several pews remained empty. Those absences would never truly disappear, yet more families attended than had in many weeks. Father Guillaume spoke about memory. He encouraged everyone not to remember only loss. Remember weddings, harvest festivals, births, laughter, shared meals. The people we miss, he said gently, would not wish every memory of them to become sorrow. Many left the church carrying lighter hearts. Grief had become such a constant companion that people sometimes forgot happiness had once existed alongside those they mourned. Late that afternoon, Martin repaired a section of roof damaged by the recent storm. From his ladder, he could see almost the entire valley. Smoke curled peacefully from chimneys. Farmers gathered hay before evening dew settled upon the fields. Women spread freshly washed clothing across wooden lines. The sight reminded him of another summer many years earlier. Nothing had changed. Everything had changed. Near sunset, Thomas climbed onto the roof, carrying a bundle of fresh straw. "You've been quiet lately," Martin observed. Thomas nodded. "I've been thinking." "About what?" The young man looked across the valley. "If we survive." Martin waited. Will people remember all this? It was a question few had considered. Ordinary people rarely imagine history while living through it. Martin thought carefully before answering. "I think they'll remember something." "The plague." "Yes." Thomas frowned. "But will they remember people like us?" Martin smiled sadly. "Perhaps not our names." He looked toward the cottages below. "But someone will remember that ordinary families endured." That answer proved remarkably close to the truth. Centuries later, historians would know almost nothing about Martin, or Thomas, or Agnes, yet millions of lives remarkably similar to theirs would shape humanity's understanding of the Black Death. The next morning, Father Guillaume announced that neighboring villages wished to exchange surplus supplies before autumn. One community possessed extra salt. Another had abundant firewood. Martin's village could spare grain. Rather than reopening large markets, several trusted representatives would quietly carry wagons between settlements. The idea pleased everyone. Cooperation had become more valuable than competition. Martin volunteered immediately. Thomas insisted upon accompanying him. Agnes hesitated. "It will mean traveling, only a few miles." Yet those few miles suddenly felt much longer than they once had. Martin understood her concern. "So do I." After a thoughtful pause, she nodded. "Then bring each other home." 3 mornings later, before dawn painted the eastern sky, 2 wagons rolled slowly out of the village. Martin drove the first. Another farmer named Elaine guided the second. Thomas walked beside the oxen, occasionally adjusting harness straps or checking the carefully covered sacks of grain. Father Guillaume blessed the travelers before they departed. May every road be kind. The journey felt strangely unfamiliar. Fields stretched peacefully toward distant forests. The air smelled of damp grass and wild mint growing beside shallow streams. Yet the roads themselves told a different story. Grass had begun growing between the wheel, ruts in places where traffic once remained constant. Several roadside inns stood closed. Their signs creaked gently in the breeze. At one crossroads, Martin noticed something else. A wayside shrine decorated with fresh flowers. Someone had recently stopped there to pray. Perhaps many people had. The travelers reached the neighboring village shortly before midday. The welcome proved warm but cautious. Smiles replaced handshakes. Conversation took place beneath open skis rather than inside crowded buildings. The exchange itself proceeded smoothly. Grain for salt, beans for candles, simple necessities. While wagons were unloaded, Martin spoke with an elderly farmer from the neighboring community. "How have things been here?" The old man looked toward his fields. "We lost some." A pause, but many remained. Martin nodded. "So did we." Neither man compared numbers. There seemed little purpose. Instead, they discussed surviving livestock, repairing tools, and preparing for winter. Life always demanded attention beyond tragedy. Before leaving, the elderly farmer handed Martin a small cloth pouch. Inside were apple seeds. "Our best tree." Martin looked surprised. "You don't have to." "I know." The old man smiled. "But plant them anyway." Such gifts had once been ordinary. Now they carried deeper meaning. They represented belief in future harvests, belief that someone would still be there to gather the fruit. As the wagons began the journey home beneath the warm afternoon sun, Thomas looked back at the neighboring village, slowly disappearing behind the trees. "They're just like us." Martin followed his gaze. Yes, across Europe, thousands of ordinary communities were discovering exactly the same truth. Different accents, different customs, different landscapes. Yet beneath those differences lived families facing identical fears, making similar sacrifices, and quietly helping one another endure. The road home seemed a little less lonely than before. Neither Martin nor Thomas realized that before sunset they would encounter someone whose story would reveal just how far the Black Death had reached and how deeply it had changed the lives of those who survived it. The afternoon sun hung low over the countryside as Martin guided the wagon along the familiar road home. The oxen moved steadily, their hooves producing a slow, comforting rhythm against the packed earth. Behind them, sacks of salt and bundles of candles shifted gently with every turn of the wheels. For the first time in many weeks, the journey felt almost peaceful. Perhaps not because danger had disappeared, but because the world, despite everything, was still moving. A mile beyond the neighboring village, Martin noticed an old man sitting beside the roadside, beneath a broad elm tree. He carried no pack, no cart, no walking companions. Only a small wooden staff rested across his knees. His clothes were clean, but heavily worn, patched so many times that they had become a quilt of different fabrics, gathered over many years. As the wagon approached, the old man slowly stood. Martin drew the oxen to a halt. "Good afternoon." "And to you," the stranger replied with a gentle smile. His voice sounded calm, almost peaceful. "Are you traveling far?" The old man looked toward the horizon. "Not anymore." Martin climbed down from the wagon. The stranger did not appear ill, only tired, very tired. Thomas offered him a small loaf of bread and a flask of water. The old man accepted both with sincere gratitude. "I have not eaten since yesterday." They sat together beneath the elm, while the oxen grazed quietly nearby. After a few moments, Martin asked, "Where is your home?" The old man remained silent for a while. Finally, he answered, "It was a village near the coast." "Was?" He nodded slowly. "There isn't much of it now." No bitterness filled his voice, only acceptance. "My wife died first." He looked down at the bread, resting in his hands. "Then my sons." Another pause. "My daughters had already married into other villages. Were they safe?" "I never found them." The breeze stirred the leaves above their heads. For several moments, no one spoke. The old man eventually smiled again. "Yet I am still here." Martin noticed something remarkable. The stranger carried enormous grief, but not despair. "What keeps you traveling?" Thomas asked quietly. The old man looked toward the open fields. "People." Thomas frowned slightly. "I don't understand. I have discovered something." He broke off a small piece of bread. "No matter how much sorrow a village has seen." He smiled gently. "Someone always shares a meal." Martin thought about the anonymous loaves left outside the church, about neighbors repairing one another's roofs after the storm, about Father Guillaume carrying food from cottage to cottage, about the convent baking bread every dawn despite its own hardships. The old man was right. History often remembered catastrophe. Those who lived through it remembered kindness. Before they departed, Martin offered the stranger a place in the wagon. The old man thanked him, but declined. "I prefer walking now." "Why?" He looked down the quiet road. "It reminds me that every step is still a gift." Martin watched him disappear slowly along the winding path until the trees finally hid him from view. Neither father nor son spoke for several minutes afterward. The encounter felt strangely important, as though the traveler had carried wisdom gathered from roads stretching across an entire continent. By sunset, the wagons rolled safely back into the valley. Agnes hurried forward before Martin had even climbed down. Her relief was unmistakable. "You made it." "We did." She smiled. "So did supper." For the first time in many weeks, the evening meal felt almost festive. Fresh bread, vegetable stew, a few precious apples saved from the previous harvest. Nothing extravagant, yet everyone appreciated the simple joy of sharing food around the same table. Outside, twilight settled gently across the fields. Church bells rang once, not for mourning, simply marking the close of another day. Martin stepped outside before sleep. The valley lay peaceful beneath countless stars. Several cottages still remained dark, reminders of families who had not survived. Fresh graves rested quietly beside the church. The road stretching south disappeared into darkness, carrying memories that would never completely fade. Yet smoke still rose from living homes. Children still dreamed inside warm beds. The water wheel continued turning. The seasons continued changing. Life, though altered forever, had endured. The Black Death would continue affecting Europe for years. It would return in later outbreaks. Entire generations would grow up shaped by memories of loss. The plague changed farming, wages, religion, medicine, trade, and the very structure of medieval society. Labor became more valuable because so many workers had been lost. Some villages vanished completely, while others slowly rebuilt over decades. Physicians questioned long-held beliefs, and communities began paying closer attention to cleanliness, isolation, and public health, laying distant foundations for future advances. Modern historians estimate that between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population died during the pandemic, though the exact number will never be known. Behind every statistic stood ordinary people like Martin, Agnes, Thomas, Father Guillaume, the miller's apprentice, Marguerite, Henry, and countless others whose names history never recorded, but whose courage quietly shaped the future. Most survivors did not think of themselves as heroes. They simply woke each morning, fed their families, helped neighbors when they could, mourned those they lost, and continued placing one foot in front of the other. Perhaps that is the truest lesson the Black Death leaves behind. Human beings cannot always choose the hardships that arrive. They can choose whether fear becomes stronger than compassion. Across Europe, during humanity's darkest years, thousands of ordinary people quietly proved that kindness could survive even when certainty could not. Centuries have passed since those church bells echoed across medieval valleys. The cottages have disappeared. The fields have changed. The roads carry different travelers. Yet the quiet resilience of those forgotten lives still speaks to us, not through grand monuments, not through royal chronicles, but through the simple truth that civilization is often preserved by ordinary people doing ordinary acts with extraordinary perseverance. And perhaps, as you drift toward sleep tonight, it is worth remembering that history is rarely built only by famous names. More often, it is carried forward by neighbors who share bread, strangers who offer shelter, parents who protect their children, and communities that refuse to lose their humanity, even in the face of unimaginable loss. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of history's darkest chapters. If you enjoyed this slow exploration of the past, I'd truly appreciate it if you subscribed and returned for another peaceful historical journey. Until next time, sleep well and let history gently fade into dreams.